steamboats. Some were as small as 18 feet long. Buttercup was 21, I think. And here's another one on Blue Mountain Lake. So because we were built locally, and the lakes aren't that big, but they were certainly an improvement, or at least a lot of people thought they were an improvement to guide boats, where your feet would get wet, you're out there in the weather. And if you have a little steamboat like this with a canopy over it, you would keep out of the weather, and it was a lot cheaper than hiring a guide. So this was Durant's idea, is that he would put one on Blue Mountain Lake. Of course, we all know what happens, that the guides who were getting people's feet wet and taking them out through the weather got unhappy about this and hauled her out into the middle of the lake, chopped a hole below the water line, and down she went. But the interesting thing, again, that you probably all know being locals, or if you're not, I'll tell you, that it was 1959, I think, that Francis Seaman, who was the town historian at the time, knew just who to go talk to find out just where the boat was. Because although, as Stoddard points out in his guidebook, everybody knew who had done the deed, but nobody was talking. But the deed, the knowledge remained in the town, and the boat was hauled up and sits now in the back of the town hall. Here's another example, Killiqua and Racket Lake. So they were on all the little lakes around here. And so Durant's idea was that if you were vacationing on Racket Lake, you would take a steamboat up the Marion River Carry, you would walk across this little carry where the Marion River got too rocky for a boat to go in. And this is a picture of it in about 1888. And then you would get on another steamboat and keep going. Because Durant, Buttercup was meant to go all the way to Racket Falls, and then you could go on to the Saranaks. But Durant's particular interest was here in the Central Adirondacks. And you can see the sorts of grandiose ideas that he and other developers had for the land there in the Central Adirondacks. So they thought there'd be a lot of customers, and they need boats. Well, nothing daunted, when Buttercup went down to the bottom, he waited a couple years, but moved on to something greater. Now, this is actually the Island Wanderer, the new Island Wanderer. But I showed you this picture because this is up in the Thousand Islands. And this is the sort of resort business that he was after. These big excursion boats, no particular, sleeping accommodations or anything, but you get in them and you go around and watch look at the scenery. New Island Wanderer was about 110 feet long, but a little bigger than what we can use on this lake. But Durant had his grand idea, and it was the Tuscarora. And he contracted with the firm of A.C. Brown and Company in Staten Island, and to build this boat. And we don't know too much about how she was built, but probably the builders and the boilers and the engine came up from New York and built the boat here in Blue Mountain Lake, probably with local help. She was launched on June 26th in 1900. So he's gone almost 20 years from his first Buttercup. But he was getting bigger and better ideas. This is also after he built his first 3 camps on Racket Lake and was really well known among people with a lot of money for setting up this area as a recreational paradise. This is the launch of the boat in a similar configuration that you'll see in a minute. Similar to what she looks like right now, actually, because the top decks haven't been put on. And that building is what is now the Steamboat Landing Hotel Inn. So it really was a steamboat landing. And that's where the boat was hauled out in the wintertime. Lucky Tuscarora, because most of the boats here on Long Lake were just hauled up out of the water so it wouldn't freeze, but just left outside, covered up, but left outside for the winter. Here she is coming out. And maybe a little in a previous slide, you can see that she's got 2 propellers, one on either side of the rudder there. And this made her a lot more maneuverable because, as you know, had these two decks, had the twin propellers, and capacity for 300 people. And there's a great record that Harold Hochschild in his wonderful Township 34 records that Collis P. Huntington, who is, built railroads, very wealthy, bought Camp Uncas from Wayne West Durant when he needed some money, and loved the Adirondacks too. Durant brought Huntington over to look at this boat when she was under construction, and Huntington said apparently, "Oh, this is all very well, but you will have the business for her." After the Tuscarora was launched, as I say, in June, with plenty of cigars and good lager beer ordered for the assembled crowds. I'm sure the cigars were for the financiers, and the lager beer was for the workmen. But Durant was actually at the crest and very rapidly headed down in his business fortunes. And within 2 years, he was broke. Bankrupt, had to sell everything, including his transportation network, which at this point included the humongous Tuscarora, but also 2 other little steamboats on Blue Mountain Lake and several steamboats on Rapid Lake, including a big one, not quite as big as the Adirondack as big as Tuscarora. I'm not sure. But
it was small.
Yeah. And Durant had to dredge the channel, put a dam at the Marion River Carry, all to make it possible to put this great big boat on the upper chain. I mentioned that, one of the besetting factor that sent Durant on the way down, this is a picture of before he died in 1930 something, was that his buddy Collis P. Huntington died at Uncas, at Camp Uncas, and Huntington's creditors weren't as friendly with Durant, and they called it all the loans. And all the other, a number of other debtors also called in their loans, and he didn't have money to pay, so he had to give up everything. But in her heyday, she was pretty spectacular. Mostly ran just on excursion service. There really wasn't enough business to run regularly. The people who were going to the hotels and the mail and stuff like that went around in the smaller boats. Another thing that I'd like to know more about, we're finding out somewhat more, is the people who actually built the boat and who ran the boat. We know a few of them. In this picture here, we've got a crew of the people who actually ran the boat. I think that guy there, it looks like the captain there. And there had to be also a fireman and a purser. So the captain, the guy who's driving the boat, is up in the pilot house, up above the second deck. And the fireman is down below. And they have to communicate. And plus, it was pretty tricky to, as I mentioned, drive that thing around. Here she is coming into one of the docks on Blue Mountain Lake. And this is Steamboat Landing again. You can look in through the window there and see the boat inside. This must have been early in the season or late in the season. But the new owners were the Rapid Lake Transportation Company, which in the late 20s morphed into the Rapid Lake Supply, which we all know. And the guy who was running Rapid Lake Transportation Company was Maurice Callahan. And he had started out piloting the boat, and then he kind of moved into, he became a founder of the First National Bank of Old Forge, or the Adirondack National Bank, or one of those. It became quite a figure in the town. This is kind of interesting. You could also take the excursion to Blue Mountain Lake, climb Blue Mountain, and come down and take the excursion back home again. So pretty. Royce Callahan was a great friend of Al Smith, who was governor at the time. And it was because roads, you know, there were roads in the Adirondacks. They had good service roads for cars by 1929. But if there were people driving from Racket Lake north, they would pass by Royce Callahan's steamboats. And he couldn't have that. So what you had to do if you were coming from Utica Way into the Adirondacks until if you were going to Blue Mountain Lake, Long Lake, north, points north, you had to drive to Racket Lake, put your car on a ferry, on a barge that was, it was pushed from the side by one of these little steamboats, and you went all the way up to North Point, got off on the North Point Road, the Carthage Road, and then drove into Long Lake. And that was good business for Royce Callahan. And he managed to keep, so I've heard, Al Smith from forwarding a road project into the Adirondacks so that he could keep his steamboats going. But when Al Smith went out of office in the end of 1928, that was also the end of the Racket Lake Transportation Company. Until, of course, its current iteration. Now I'm going to turn this show over to Pete Hulse, leaving the Tuscarora in that shed where she was laid up until 1934. And what happened in 1934, Pete?
Okay.
Before you go on, we know it was steam. What was producing this steam? Was
Coal.
it wood or coal?
Coal. All these little